Chapter 8: Further Expansion. As time passed, we continued to expand our maternity business across the country until we had about 55 stores. By the mid-70s, we were living with a major problem. None of the three principals of the company, my father, Jack, nor I, had the competence we needed to run and manage a retail fashion chain spread out across Canada. So we decided to bring in some new management and began to build an infrastructure. Of course, more people and more infrastructure involved more cost, and 55 small maternity stores could not support the additional cost. We needed to grow our business. If we did not grow, we would not have the synergies and the economies of scale we needed to be financially viable. Given the demographics of Canada, it was becoming difficult to continue expanding our maternity business simply because further expansion would eventually lead to our cannibalizing our existing stores. That was a serious problem for us because the maternity business was the only business we were in. So we began to explore other avenues for growth, and information came our way that once again set us off in a new direction. The plus-size business. At the time, maternity garments were made large and oversized to hide pregnancy. That meant that many maternity garments could accommodate plus-size customers. Our maternity stores were the only stores where plus-size ladies could find younger, fashionable clothes to fit them. So many of them came to our maternity stores to shop, and we realized that there was a need in the marketplace for younger, stylish, plus-size fashions. At the same time, plus-size women in the United States were also demanding younger, more fashionable styles. The U.S. maternity manufacturers were the first to respond to this demand. They started to produce some of their maternity styles in plus sizes, and they were very successful. Several of them encouraged me to start a retail division for plus size clothing in Canada. So the combination of knowing from our own experience that there was a growing demand for plus sizes, having access to reliable sources from the US, and knowing that we would soon max out our maternity business led us to start a new retail division for younger, fashionable plus sizes, Additionelle. In May 1979, I hired Louise Tanguay as the buyer for the new Additionelle division, and we set out to reinvent the plus-size business for Canada. I say reinvent because there was already a well-established plus-size business, Pennington's, but it catered primarily to mature women. Louise and I worked well together, and in the fall of 1979, we opened our first Additionelle store in Montreal in the St. Bruno Shopping Centre. Although it got off to a slow start, over time, as we learned more about our customers, our assortments became more focused and we started to do well. By the late 80s, we had expanded the division across the country to about 85 stores and were the dominant retailer for the younger fashion-conscious plus-size customer in Canada. In the spring of 1993, we started another plus-size division featuring casual sports clothing for even younger customers, AE Sport & Company. And in 1997, after we had about 30 AE Sports stores, we started a third plus-size division called Lingerie by Additionelle. The three separate divisions were combined into one large store with 3 doors under 3 separate banners. By the time we sold the business in 2002, we actually had more than 200 plus-size stores under those 3 banners in 85 locations. As that business grew, I backed off from the day-to-day buying and merchandising and became more involved in management, organizational development, and strategy. As I backed off, Louise Tanguay took on more and more responsibility. As vice president of merchandise for the plus-size division, Louise was unquestionably responsible for the success of that business. More family dynamics. In the meantime, we had to deal with some challenging family matters. I mentioned that our early years were an enormous struggle. We went through several years on the verge of bankruptcy and were under constant financial pressure. Given my father's background, those years were very hard on him. He was terribly afraid that he and his family would not make a living and that all of us would be out on the street. He wanted us to be very conservative and to avoid taking risks. On the other hand, I was determined to build the business. I was like Lord Nelson. I put my hand over my good eye and said, "I do not see the enemy." I just kept plodding along, building and expanding. So my dad and I found ourselves pulling in opposite directions, and this created a lot of friction between the two of us. When my younger sister Ellen married Peter Shapiro, Peter had not yet established himself in a career, and as we were already in a family business, we invited him to come in as a partner. However, because Peter had almost no business experience, we immediately became not just three incompetents driving the business, we were four, and that added more tension. As I added more staff to our management team, my father and Jack felt more and more isolated, and this too added tension. Unfortunately, the strain of our business relationships spilled over into our private lives and affected everyone in the family. Sadly, we lived with those dynamics for almost 8 years until my father died. So much for a family business. A chicken farm? At one point in the early years when we were having financial difficulties and my father was afraid that we wouldn't make it, he went to visit a cousin in Connecticut who had a successful chicken farm. While he was there, he inquired into the possibility of our entire family moving to Connecticut and opening up another chicken farm. His cousin thought that was a good idea, and my dad came home very excited by the prospect and suggested that we close down the business where all of us were working very hard and accomplishing very little, and all move to Connecticut and start a chicken farm. He told us, "I don't see us being successful in the retail fashion business. It is a very difficult business, and I'm sure we could do much better in the chicken business." When Shirley heard this, she stood up, put her hands on her hips, and said, "I am not moving from Montreal, and I am not going to Connecticut to live in chicken shit. Besides, I have faith that we will make it in the fashion business, and we don't need to run away." And that was that. If she wasn't going, I wasn't going, so none of us went. The story of Sally Simmons in Edmonton was not an isolated case. It showed how inept we were as an organization at that time. As we continued our expansion nationally, we needed more help, so I decided to search for an executive vice president to help us manage the company. I contacted Alan Etkovich, an industrial psychologist who specialized in executive placement, and asked him to do a search for an executive vice president. He agreed, but he told me that in order to find someone who would complement me, he would have to get to know me better. He asked me to come in for 2 days of intensive aptitude testing, which I did. A couple of days later, I met with him to review the results. He opened our discussion with, "Max, according to the test results and my interviews with you, it is my opinion that you do not have the temperament or ability to manage a medium to large size company. If you persist and expand your business beyond where it is, you will fail. You are not a businessman. You are best suited to be a social worker." Considering what was to happen over the next 30 years, one cannot argue that he was completely wrong. In fact, he was actually quite accurate. The person he was describing was really who I was at the time. I accepted Etkovich's evaluation as being the truth. However, I refused to accept that I could not change that truth, and I started to explore what it would take to become an effective leader of an organization. As things turned out, I did not follow through with Mr. Etkovich's mandate to hire an executive vice president because I had an opportunity to hire someone I knew. In 1978, MIA Fashions, a fashion retailer in Montreal, went bankrupt, and I was able to persuade Lori Lewin, the executive vice president of that company, to join our organization. Lori had been trained as a professional manager in the UK before coming to Canada, and he brought with him a whole set of management skills, abilities, and experience that we hadn't had up until then. He was a valuable asset to our business and a great compliment to me personally. A couple of years later, in 1980, I further strengthened our management team when I invited James Laundrie to join us. James was a CA and had been a partner with our accounting firm. He joined us as a VP Finance and over time became Executive Vice President, the number 2 person in the company and my closest confidant. James remained with the company in that capacity until Shermax was sold in 2002. I will have more to say about both Lori and James later. In 1978, when my son Philip was 15, he spent a year at a school on a kibbutz in Israel. Not long after Lori joined us, Shirley and I went to Israel to visit Philip. Coincidentally, my parents were in Israel on holiday at the same time. While there, Shirley and I spent 4 very special days with my mother and father in Jerusalem. The business pressures and conflicts between my father and me were left in Montreal, and we enjoyed a marvelous time together. My father knew everything about the history and geography of Israel, and he took charge. He was our tour guide, and he gave us an incredible lesson on that country. It was a wonderful experience. When Shirley and I returned home, we left Philip in school and my parents to finish their holiday in Israel. From our time together there, I saw how different my father was away from the business and how happy he could be. That experience made me aware of the sacrifices we were making by having my father in the business with me. I decided the time had come for him to retire. Peace with my father. My parents returned from Israel the day before I was scheduled to leave on a buying trip to Europe. That evening, I said to my dad, "I'm leaving for Europe on a buying trip tomorrow, but before I go, I want to tell you that I think it's time for you to leave the business. The strain of the business and our family relationships is taking its toll on you, and it's costing us all dearly. When I come back from Europe, I would like us to go to Florida, and I will help you buy an apartment for you and Mom. You can spend winters there and the summers here. Dad, we've got to do this. It is time for you to leave the business." I tormented myself before I approached my dad with this proposition. I was sure he would be devastated and would absolutely refuse. I was prepared for a battle, but to my surprise he agreed, and so I left for Europe the next day. On the plane trip over, I began to feel very uneasy. The way my dad gave in was totally out of character for him, and I wondered if he was becoming depressed again. Unfortunately, it was much worse than that. 2 weeks later, when I returned to Montreal, Shirley met me at the airport with the news that my dad was in the hospital with lung cancer and a brain tumor. He was dying. I was devastated, as were we all. My dad had been a chain smoker since he was 14, and I guess it caught up with him. I went to the hospital and did not leave his bedside day and night. I shaved him and washed him, and I took care of him until he died 7 weeks later. Ironically, he did not die as a result of his cancer. The doctors had actually projected an additional year for him. He died 48 hours after his first chemotherapy treatment, which knocked out his immune system. Although our grief was almost beyond our ability to endure, those 7 weeks were truly amazing. My father was dying, but he quickly came to terms with it, and he actually seemed to embrace it. He had spent his entire life in a huge struggle. He worried about everything and worried for everyone, and most of all, he lived with huge guilt of having survived the Holocaust. For the first time in his 66 years, he gave up struggling and was at peace. His only concern was for our mother and her well-being after he was gone. He had always kept his affairs in order, so there was very little to do in that respect. He spent his last days empowering all of us. He called us together and spoke to us as a group, and then to each of us separately. He gave us each a lecture, his advice on how we should live our lives, and he gave us his blessing. Before he died, he told me in front of everyone that as his eldest son, he expected me to take care of the family. I was honored that he expressed that kind of confidence in me. Those 7 weeks were a blessing for all of us. Although there was a lot of sadness, there was also a huge amount of love and inspiration. The fact that our father was dying became a catalyst for us to put aside whatever family difficulties we were having. From that time on, we have all been a wonderful, supportive family to each other. I mentioned earlier that my dad was a Kazan. I loved to go to services when he was officiating. He had a beautiful voice and put an incredible amount of heart into chanting the services. I was so proud of him. In the last weeks before he died, although he was weakening continuously, he recorded many of the songs and chants from various services. He wanted that to be a part of his legacy to his family. We all have copies of those tapes and we cherish them dearly. Soon after my father passed away, Jack decided that it was time for him to leave the business. He had raised the subject with me on several occasions in the past, but I had always been able to talk him out of it. Jack was my best friend and we worked very well together. But I knew he was not happy, so I agreed. I arranged to buy him out, and at the same time I also bought Peter out. Thus, each of us went our separate ways in business. Eliminating the tensions in our business relationships allowed us to appreciate each other and to become the family we are now.